The police stormed toward my cabin for the 5th time in 3 months, weapons ready as if responding to a violent crime. All because I dared paint my own property blue. The HOA tyrant, Diana Peterson, stood watching with a triumphant smirk that screamed she believed she'd finally crushed me. She had no idea what was coming. Her pristine reputation, iron grip on the community, and secret deal were about to explode in the most satisfying courtroom takedown this county had ever witnessed. Bullies with badges and bylaws expect submission, not calculated resistance. But I wasn't just fighting back. I was about to win. After the pandemic, I needed a change. Working remotely as a freelance programmer meant I could live anywhere with decent internet, and I'd always dreamed of a place by the water. When I found the listing for a small wooden cabin on Lake Pinehurst in Wisconsin, something clicked deep inside me. The real estate agent described it as one of the original structures from the 1970s, a quiet retreat with a perfect lake view and miles of forest behind it. What she didn't mention was that I'd also be inheriting a neighborhood war along with the deed. My first week there was peaceful. I set up my desk near the big lake-facing window, coding while watching sunlight ripple over the water. The air was clean, the silence almost sacred. I decided to freshen up the faded porch with a coat of deep cobalt blue, bold, different, alive. It wasn't about standing out. It was about making this place mine. I was halfway through painting when a shadow fell across the porch. The figure standing below looked like she'd stepped straight out of a corporate brochure. Pressed shirt, perfect hair, disapproval etched into every line of her face. That was Diana Peterson, president of the Pinehurst Lake Homeowners Association. She announced herself with the kind of authority people use when they've never been told no. She handed me a thick binder of rules and insisted that all properties around the lake must conform to community standards. My cabin, I explained, wasn't even part of the HOA. That didn't seem to matter to her. The smile on her face was sharp as glass as she said, "We'll see about that." I laughed it off then. Just a local busybody, I thought. Someone who couldn't stand seeing anything that didn't fit her beige little kingdom. But within days, the notices began. Unauthorized color selection, improper outdoor furniture placement, unapproved landscaping. Each printed like an official government summons and slipped under my door. It was almost funny, until the sheriff showed up. Sheriff Mike Donovan looked embarrassed as he knocked on my door. He'd received a complaint of unauthorized construction. I showed him my documents proving my property lay outside HOA jurisdiction. He agreed and told Diana there was nothing he could do. Her face reddened with fury as she stormed away, phone in hand. I thought that was the end of it. That evening, my neighbor Sarah Williams stopped by. She was kind, nervous, and clearly worn down by HOA life. She warned me quietly that Diana had made it her mission to absorb every cabin on the lake into her regime. Mine was the last holdout. The previous owner, she said, had been driven out after months of relentless harassment. A few days later, I met Herb Thompson, an elderly man with a cane and the kind of calm only age and experience bring. He'd lived on the lake since before the HOA existed. When he heard what was happening, his expression darkened. "You're up against more than petty rules," he warned. "There's a developer behind her, wants to buy the whole lake. The HOA board gets a commission when they sell everyone out. Your cabin's the last obstacle." His advice was simple. Document everything. At first, I didn't take it seriously. But then came the late-night knocks, the strangers photographing my car, the daily violation notices taped to my mailbox. One morning, I found a letter from an attorney named Thomas Reed threatening legal action if I didn't repaint my porch within 7 days. That's when I realized this wasn't just a nosy neighbor problem. This was organized harassment. I spent hours at the county records office, combing through documents until I found the truth. 5 cabins, including mine, had existed decades before the HOA. We were legally outside their jurisdiction, but for years Diana had been bullying each owner until they either sold out or joined. I was the last one standing. The pattern was undeniable. Intimidation, fines, fake violations, then pressure to sell. Some of the past owners had been sabotaged. A storm had mysteriously destroyed one man's boat after he refused a buyout. Another had his mailbox smashed repeatedly until he finally sold below market value. Each case followed the same strategy. Make life miserable until resistance broke. But mine wouldn't. I began building a file of evidence. Every letter, every photograph, every false claim. I backed it all up to cloud storage. If they wanted a war, I'd give them one. That night, as I sat on my blue porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, I thought about my father, a lawyer who'd spent his life standing up to people who abused power. His words came back to me clearly. Bullies only win when you stop fighting. Diana Peterson believed she was untouchable, protected by connections and bylaws. But she just picked a fight with someone who didn't scare easily, and who knew how to build a case. The next time the sheriff's cruiser pulled into my driveway, I wasn't caught off guard. I was ready, and that was when I realized this wasn't about paint anymore. This was about control, money, and power, and I wasn't backing down. By the time the sheriff's cruiser rolled up again, I'd stopped feeling anxious. I expected it now, the slow crunch of gravel, the flashing lights painting my walls red and blue, the same look of reluctant apology on Sheriff Donovan's face. Each visit was just another move in Diana Peterson's endless game of control. This time she stood at the edge of my driveway with 2 other HOA board members, all of them filming with their phones. The sheriff approached, muttering something about a noise complaint involving power tools. The supposed offense? I had fixed a loose chair leg with an electric screwdriver at 2 in the afternoon. Donovan seemed embarrassed as he handed me the complaint form. "You're outside their jurisdiction," he said quietly. "But she's got friends in the county office." Be careful, be careful." Those words echoed in my head long after he left. That night, I looked at the stack of notices pinned to my bulletin board. Unauthorized paint color, improper plant selection, excessive vehicle presence. It looked less like community enforcement and more like psychological warfare. So I turned to my only real weapon, research. For days, I haunted the county records office, digging through dusty files that hadn't been touched in decades. I traced the original boundaries of the Pinarist Lake Homeowners Association and confirmed what I already knew. My cabin and 4 others on the North Shore had never been part of it. Then, deep in an old filing cabinet, I found a faded note on a property map, Historic Overlay Zone. The words meant nothing to me at the time, but I wrote them down anyway. It was while I was squinting at those maps that an elderly clerk at the desk leaned over and whispered, "You might want to check the Wisconsin Area Freedom Act of 1983. I blinked. "What's that?" "It's an old state law," she said, lowering her voice. "Not many people know about it, but it prohibits homeowners associations from enforcing rules on properties not legally registered within their jurisdiction. It even carries penalties for HOAs that try." She printed me a copy of the statute. The language was crystal clear. No homeowners association may impose or enforce architectural, aesthetic, or usage restrictions upon properties not legally incorporated within its registered boundaries at the time of enforcement. I stared at the paper for a long moment. The law was unambiguous. Diana's entire campaign wasn't just harassment, it was illegal. That single discovery flipped the power dynamic entirely. For weeks she'd been the hunter, and I'd been the cornered target. Now I finally had the weapon to fight back. I went home, scanned every page of the Freedom Act, and began building my case. I compiled every violation notice, every letter, every instance of false police reporting. I even included time-stamped videos showing her agents trespassing to take photographs of my car and property. The next morning, I reached out to the other 4 property owners on the North Shore, the last holdouts outside HOA control. We met quietly at Herb Thompson's cabin, away from prying eyes. There was a retired teacher, a doctor and his wife, and a young couple who had inherited their cabin from grandparents. Each of them had the same story: years of intimidation, fines, and threats for not joining the HOA. When I showed them the Freedom Act, the room went silent. It was the first time any of us had seen a law that directly protected our independence. "We're forming an alliance," I said simply. "If she comes after one of us, she faces all of us." That night, we all signed a joint cease and desist letter to the HOA, citing the Freedom Act and demanding an end to all enforcement actions. Copies were sent to the county clerk, the sheriff's department, and the HOA board. Diana's response was immediate and venomous. Within 24 hours, her lawyer cousin, Thomas Reed, sent a letter claiming the Freedom Act was obsolete and superseded by modern community development statutes. It ended with a threat. "The association recommends you consult with a real attorney before making further legally unsound assertions." I read the letter twice. The condescension was deliberate, but something about it didn't sit right with me. His arguments were vague, his citations non-existent. It felt less like confidence and more like fear. I began to suspect they were hiding something deeper, something that made their entire operation vulnerable. Meanwhile, the harassment continued. I woke up one morning to find a fresh violation. Notice taped to my door accusing me of excessive lake viewing. Another warned me that my mailbox design violated visual harmony standards. The absurdity was infuriating, but instead of getting angry, I smiled. Each ridiculous notice was another piece of evidence for my growing case file. Still, I wasn't the only one under fire. Sarah texted me one night, terrified. Diana had called an emergency community meeting, naming me a disruptive element. She told members to avoid contact with me or face penalties. Themselves, I'd officially been declared the lake's public enemy #1. But bullies overreach when they start to lose control. And Diana Peterson was beginning to lose control. I spent hours cross-referencing property documents, boundary maps, and HOA filings. The pattern was unmistakable. Their legal foundation was a house of cards. If I could expose their manipulation, it would all come crashing down. Then, buried in a stack of property development proposals, I found something explosive, a preliminary draft titled Pinehurst Lake Luxury Resort and Spa. It was dated only 3 months before I bought my cabin. The proposal outlined plans to buy every lakefront property, demolish the cabins, and replace them with a massive resort complex. Each HOA board member would receive a hefty commission for securing full property control. Diana's payout, double the others. The revelation hit like a thunderclap. She wasn't protecting the community. She was selling it. Everything made sense now. The bullying, the fake violations, the endless pressure to conform. My blue porch wasn't her problem. It was my resistance. My refusal to sell stood between her and a multi-million-dollar deal. The HOA wasn't acting out of civic duty. It was a front for a land grab. That night, as rain began to fall on the lake and thunder rolled in the distance, I organized the documents into folders, labeling each one carefully. Every page of evidence, every map, every statute citation. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt completely calm. Diana Peterson had used bylaws and intimidation as her weapons. I had truth, law, and patience as mine, and I was about to use all three. The storm rolled in heavy and low that night, thunder rumbling across Lake Pinehurst like distant artillery. Lightning flashed over the water, illuminating the pine trees that lined the shore. It felt poetic, nature's own warning shot, marking the point where my quiet resistance would become open war. By morning, the sky had cleared, but the tension in the neighborhood hadn't. Diana Peterson's war machine had shifted into overdrive. Within 48 hours of sending my cease and desist letter, I was hit with a barrage of new notices. Each one was more absurd than the last. Improper placement of a bird feeder, visual disharmony caused by my recycling bin, and even unauthorized display of personal items, referring to a small wind chime Sarah had gifted me months earlier. It was no longer intimidation. It was obsession. But while Diana was busy playing tyrant, I was quietly preparing the evidence that would destroy her entire operation. The resort proposal I'd discovered wasn't just a speculative plan, it was a full acquisition strategy. The developer, Meridian Development Group, had partnered with the HOA board to consolidate control of the entire lakefront. Every signature counted, every holdout mattered, and I was the final obstacle standing between Diana and her payday. I spent days combing through the proposal line by line. Each page revealed more corruption, board member consulting fees, plans to divert HOA reserve funds into facilitation, expenses, and a note about confidential property transition agreements. The board wasn't serving the community. They were selling it off piece by piece. The development plans were devastating to look at. The rustic shoreline I'd fallen in love with would be replaced by a sprawling resort complex, a golf course, artificial beaches, and hundreds of rental units. The tranquil lake that once echoed with the sound of loons and fishing boats would become another overbuilt, overpriced tourist trap. There was even a line item for lake reshaping, a euphemism for draining and redirecting part of the natural waterway to make room for luxury amenities. It was an environmental disaster in the making. I scanned everything, backed it up, and organized copies in both physical and cloud drives. Evidence like this had a tendency to vanish when power was at stake, but Diana wasn't slowing down. The following week, she escalated from letters to full public defamation. Posts began appearing in the local neighborhood forum accusing me of operating an illegal business from my home, lowering property values, and harassing community members. The language was clinical, clearly written by a lawyer but designed to look like the voice of concerned neighbors. I recognized Thomas Reed's style. Immediately, it didn't take long before my business page was flooded with one-star reviews from anonymous accounts. My email filled with fake complaints from clients who didn't exist. Someone even reported my address to the county for illegal waste disposal, a claim that brought an inspector to my property, who left shaking his head in disbelief. Each attack was another desperate move from people who knew they were losing control. Through it all, I documented everything. Screenshots, names, timestamps, copies of every false claim. Herb was right. Diana didn't play fair, but neither did I. Then came the turning point. One morning, as I was reviewing digital copies of the HOA filings, I noticed a strange inconsistency in the maps. The version the HOA had submitted to the county showed a boundary line that had been subtly redrawn to include my property and 4 others. But the original 1995 filing, archived deep in the county's records, showed those same cabins clearly outside the boundary. Someone had altered official documents. That was more than harassment. It was fraud. I called the county clerk's office and requested certified copies of both maps. When they arrived, the difference was undeniable. The HOA's version had been digitally modified. The altered map bore the signature of Thomas Reed and the HOA president, Diana Peterson. They hadn't just tried to intimidate me. They had falsified legal documents to claim authority they didn't have. It was a serious crime, and they had left fingerprints all over it. The more I uncovered, the clearer the pattern became. The harassment wasn't random. It was a coordinated campaign to drive down morale and push holdouts into selling cheaply. Once all properties were under HOA control, the board would have full legal standing to approve the resort sale unanimously. Every complaint, every police call, every rumor, it was all part of the same machine. But while they were trying to destroy my peace, they had made a fatal mistake. They had underestimated how methodical a programmer could be. I built a full digital archive of every event, organizing evidence by category, timestamp, and legal relevance. I even coded a small script that indexed each document by keyword: harassment, falsification, developer, and HOA. What they had spent years building on manipulation, I was dismantling with precision. Then, as if to confirm the depth of their corruption, the storm hit. That night, a heavy front rolled in from the north, battering the lake with rain and wind. Trees fell. Power lines snapped. My cabin roof took serious damage, shingles torn loose by the gale. By dawn, water had started dripping through the ceiling. I worked quickly, buying supplies from town and covering the roof with a tarp. The damage wasn't catastrophic, but it was bad enough that I needed to repair it immediately to prevent rot. As I began the repairs, something remarkable happened. Neighbors I'd never met came by to help. A retired man brought coffee. A young family dropped off sandwiches and spare nails. None of them were HOA members, just regular people who still believed in being neighbors. For the first time since I moved here, I felt a sense of community. But Diana couldn't stand that. Within hours, she issued a new emergency ordinance under the guise of storm recovery management. The document, hastily written and faxed to the county, claimed the HOA had been granted temporary jurisdiction over all lakefront properties to ensure aesthetic and structural compliance during disaster restoration. It was nonsense, bureaucratic, word salad designed to sound official, but it worked. The county emergency office, overwhelmed with storm damage across the region, approved it without question. Diana had found a way to weaponize the disaster. By the next morning, she had posted her new recovery standards online, mandating approved colors, materials, and repair methods for every visible structure around the lake. My blue porch and unapproved shingles were now listed as immediate hazards to community uniformity. She'd turned a natural disaster into a power grab. That same afternoon, A courier arrived with a court summons. The HOA was suing me for willful violation of emergency safety protocols. Attached to the complaint was the altered boundary map, the same falsified document that now placed my cabin inside HOA jurisdiction. It was bold, it was reckless, and it was her biggest mistake yet, because this time she wasn't just harassing me. She was committing provable document fraud, and I had every piece of evidence to prove it. As I stood on my porch watching storm clouds drift away over the lake, I felt no fear. Just a cold, calm certainty. The battle for Lake Pinarest had officially shifted. The HOA had fired its last shot. Now it was my turn. The morning the court summons arrived, the air over Lake Pinarest felt heavier than the storm that had just passed. The sky hung low, gray and wet, the kind of day when the world seems to hold its breath. In my hands was a neatly sealed envelope bearing the county court's insignia and the HOA's name stamped across the top. It wasn't unexpected, but seeing it in print made the conflict official. The Pinarest Lake Homeowners Association was suing me for willful violation of emergency safety protocols. They accused me of endangering the community by repairing my roof without their authorization. And the attached map, complete with the HOA's forged boundaries, claimed my property was under their jurisdiction. It was a bold lie, dressed up as legality, and they had submitted it to the court with signatures and seals. I knew then that this was no longer a property dispute. It was a war over truth itself. While rainwater still dripped from the tarp over my roof, I started preparing for battle. I gathered every piece of documentation: the original property maps, the Freedom Act, copies of the falsified boundary submissions, and the developer's resort proposal that exposed their motives. My file had grown thick, a chronicle of months of intimidation, deceit, and manipulation. I didn't hire a lawyer. Not yet. Something inside me wanted to face them myself. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was principle. I wanted to stand in front of the court and show exactly what this was: a small group of powerful people trying to crush anyone who refused to bow. While I built my defense, the HOA doubled down on its campaign. They started circulating flyers around the neighborhood warning residents about unsafe reconstruction practices on my property. A local Facebook group was flooded with staged photos of my half-fixed roof captioned with words like reckless, dangerous, and non-compliant. But something had shifted in the tone of the community. The constant fear that Diana Peterson had cultivated for years was cracking. Residents were starting to whisper. Then one evening, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. It was Patricia Anderson, the HOA treasurer. Her voice trembled, but her message was clear. She was done protecting Diana. She had seen the forged maps herself, and she was ready to testify that the documents submitted to the county had been altered. Her conscience had finally outweighed her fear. The next morning, she arrived at my cabin carrying a flash drive and a handwritten statement. On it were digital versions of the original maps, unedited, time-stamped, and stored on the HOA office computer before they were altered. They were proof that the boundary manipulation had been deliberate. She confessed that during a private meeting, Diana and Thomas Reed had justified the forgery as a temporary correction to reflect reality. In truth, it had been the final step in forcing the last holdouts under HOA control before the resort sale. Her statement was the missing piece of the puzzle. I organized everything into a single binder, labeling each section meticulously: boundaries, harassment, fraud, developer conflict. Every page told the story of a power structure built on lies. By the time the court date arrived, word had spread through the community. HOA members who once feared Diana now viewed her with suspicion. Neighbors who had ignored my plight were starting to realize that the same machine she used against me could one day be used against them. The courthouse was crowded that morning. Lake Pinarest had never seen a case like it. An HOA president, her attorney cousin, and one defiant homeowner locked in a legal showdown that had captured the entire county's attention. I arrived early, wearing the same calm expression I had when I'd first painted my porch blue. My evidence was organized, my timeline airtight. I wasn't nervous. I was ready. When the hearing began, the HOA presented its case with the same arrogance that had defined every one of Diana's actions. They portrayed themselves as protectors of order, claiming I had ignored safety standards during storm repairs. They used their altered maps to assert jurisdiction and cited the emergency ordinance as proof of their temporary authority. But authority built on fraud collapses under scrutiny. When it was my turn, I presented the certified county documents, the original maps from 1995, showing my cabin clearly outside HOA boundaries. I then introduced the Wisconsin Area Freedom Act, the old but still binding law that explicitly prohibited HOAs from enforcing rules beyond their legal limits. Next, I produced Patricia Anderson's sworn statement, followed by the flash drive containing the unaltered digital files. The timestamps proved that the HOA had knowingly modified the maps before submitting them to court. The room fell silent. Even those who had come to support Diana began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. I moved next to motive. The resort proposal, the secret commissions, the plan to sell out the lakefront community for profit. I laid it all bare, page by page, until every person in that room could see what this had really been about. Not safety, not community, but greed. When I finished, the judge reviewed the documents for several long minutes. Then she looked up, expression stern and unamused. She asked a single question. Why had the HOA not disclosed the existence of these proposed development contracts? The silence that followed was the sound of a rain ending. For years, Diana Peterson had ruled through intimidation, hiding her motives behind polished language and endless rules. But now her control was gone. The law she had twisted for power had finally turned against her. The judge dismissed their injunction and ordered an investigation into document falsification and misuse of emergency powers. She ruled that the HOA had no jurisdiction over my property or any of the North Shore cabins, and referred the matter to the district attorney's office. In that instant, the power shifted permanently. The once feared president of the Pinerist Lake HOA sat frozen, her carefully composed mask slipping away. The lawyer cousin who had mocked me in letters suddenly found himself facing potential disbarment. The board members who had followed Diana's orders looked pale and shaken, realizing how close they had come to criminal liability. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. Cameras clicked. The story of the HOA versus the cabin owner spread quickly, first through local channels, then across online forums and homeowner advocacy pages. But for me, the victory wasn't about headlines. It was about peace. For the first time in months, I stood on my porch that evening and breathed without tension in my chest. The lake was calm again. The reflection of my blue porch shimmered peacefully on the water's surface. Yet the fight wasn't completely over. In the aftermath of the ruling, I discovered something extraordinary in the court. Records. Something that changed everything about Lake Pinerist's future. That faint pencil marking I had once, seen on the old property map. Historic overlay. Zone wasn't a random note. It was a designation with legal power. And it was about to become the final blow that would not only end Diana's influence, but protect the entire lake from any future threat. The courthouse victory should have felt like the end, but it was only the beginning. Winning the case freed me from the HOA's grip, but the question remained, how could I make sure no one else ever faced this kind of abuse again? I'd watched Diana Peterson twist authority, falsify maps, and nearly destroy a community, all because the system allowed it. If I walked away now, she or someone like her could rise again. The answer lay buried in a piece of history almost lost to time. When I revisited the old county archives to finalize copies of my evidence, I kept thinking about the faint words I'd seen weeks earlier penciled across that ancient survey map. Historic overlay zone. At the time, I had dismissed it as a clerical note. Now, curiosity pushed me to dig deeper. I pulled dusty boxes from high shelves, sifting through documents that smelled faintly of old paper and lake water. Beneath layers of meeting minutes and property ledgers, I found what I was looking for, a thin binder marked Wisconsin Historical Preservation Board, 1968. Inside was a decree stamped with the state seal, designation of the Lake Pinerist Historic Preservation District. My pulse quickened as I read. The entire lakefront, including the surrounding cabins and forest buffer zone, had been granted protected status in 1968 because of its unique ecosystem, its original 20th century architecture, and its cultural significance as one of the few surviving natural recreation areas in the state. The law restricted any commercial or large-scale development without the approval of the Wisconsin Historical Preservation Board. The implications were staggering. Not only had Diana and her developer allies broken HOA boundaries, they had tried to push through a resort project that violated a binding state preservation law. The land they had schemed to sell for millions was, by law, untouchable. The oversight was almost tragic in its simplicity. When property records had been digitized in the 1990s, the historic designation hadn't been properly flagged in the modern database. It was still valid, but forgotten. For decades, the protection had been invisible, buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and ignorance. I gathered everything: copies of the 1968 designation, the original zoning maps, and the official language detailing the restrictions. Each line reinforced the same fact. Lake Pinnerest wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a protected landmark. Armed with this new evidence, I contacted the county planning department. The reaction was immediate. The Preservation Board confirmed that the designation was still in effect, and that any attempt to alter the shoreline, demolish structures, or introduce large-scale development without state review was a direct violation of preservation law. The impact rippled fast. Meridian Development Group's entire resort proposal was halted. Construction permits were suspended, pending a full state investigation. County officials demanded the HOA produce all communications with the developer, and once those were reviewed, the scope of the conspiracy became undeniable. The press loved the story. What began as a small-town property feud had evolved into a statewide scandal involving falsified documents, illegal development deals, and the near destruction of a historic site. Diana Peterson's name was everywhere. Now, but for all the wrong reasons. Investigators uncovered financial records showing she had accepted consulting advances from the developers months before the resort proposal became public. Her attorney cousin, Thomas Reed, had signed several of the same agreements under his firm's letterhead. Both were now subjects of a criminal investigation for fraud, conspiracy, and falsification of public documents. For the community, the fallout was seismic. HOA members who had once defended Diana began turning against her. Emergency meetings were called. Votes of no confidence circulated. And by the end of the month, she had resigned in disgrace. The board she once ruled like a monarch collapsed under scrutiny. In its place, new leadership emerged. Neighbors who valued cooperation over control and transparency over intimidation. Sarah Williams, the quiet designer who had warned me early on, was elected the new HOA president by unanimous vote. Her first order of business was to repeal dozens of pointless aesthetic rules and formally acknowledge the non-HOA property's independence. But my fight didn't stop there. I took the preservation documents to the state office and worked with a representative to update the official registry. Lake Pinnerest's protected status was restored in the digital database, ensuring no future developer could ever exploit the oversight again. For the first time in years, the community had a shared purpose, not conformity, but preservation. That summer, the transformation was visible. The lake was alive again. Families who had hidden behind drawn blinds began sitting on porches and waving to one another. The old cabins, once symbols of defiance, were now symbols of freedom. The line that had divided HOA and non-HOA vanished, replaced by a shared understanding that power should never rest in the hands of those who crave it most. The sheriff stopped by one afternoon, not on official duty, but as a friend. He apologized for every visit he'd been forced to make, every false report he'd been obliged to answer. He admitted that the case had changed how he viewed authority, that sometimes the right thing to do was question those who claimed to know best. As the lake returned to peace, Diana's world fell apart. The investigations drained her finances. The Bar Association suspended Thomas Reed pending ethics review. The development company withdrew from the region entirely, citing legal complications. And as for Diana, she sold her prized lakefront cabin to cover mounting legal fees. Word spread that she'd moved to a small trailer park outside town, far from the lake she once ruled. No one visited, but the irony wasn't lost on anyone. The woman who had obsessed over controlling every shade of paint around the lake was now living in a world of aluminum siding and gravel lots. For me, victory didn't look like triumph. It looked like stillness, peace, the absence of chaos. Standing on my repaired roof, looking over the water, I felt something settle inside me. Justice had been served, but something deeper had been restored. the balance of a place that had nearly been lost to greed. In the end, Lake Pinnerest didn't just survive Diana Peterson. It healed, and beneath that calm surface, preserved forever by law and memory, was the story of one simple act of defiance, a blue porch that started a revolution. Summer came early that year, as if nature itself wanted to celebrate. The air over Lake Pinnerest shimmered with heat and renewal. The water was still, reflecting the tall pines and cloudless sky like glass. After months of conflict, courtrooms, and revelations, the lake had finally returned to silence, the kind of silence that feels earned. The HOA no longer felt like an invisible government. It had become what it was meant to be, a volunteer committee run by neighbors who actually cared. The new leadership, led by Sarah Williams, stripped away decades of unnecessary regulations. Gone were the color codes, the mandatory landscaping inspections, and the intimidation disguised as community standards. What remained was simple cooperation. People maintaining their homes not because of fear, but pride. The old blue porch that had started it all had become a quiet symbol of that freedom. Visitors often stopped at the edge of my property just to look at it, sometimes snapping photos. Some called it the porch that beat the HOA. Others simply nodded, understanding the unspoken meaning. It stood as proof that ordinary people could push back against corruption and win. In the months that followed, the ripples of what happened at Lake Pinnerest spread far beyond Wisconsin. News outlets ran features on the case. Homeowners from across the country reached out, sharing their own stories of overreach, intimidation, and control. Many asked for advice. Others just wanted to thank someone for standing up when most people would have sold and walked away. That was when I realized the fight wasn't over. It had just changed shape. I began compiling everything. I had learned into a handbook, a guide for homeowners on how to protect themselves from abusive HOAs. I filled it with case studies, legal resources, and examples of common tactics used by associations to manipulate or pressure residents. I called it the Homeowner's Shield, standing against HOA abuse. I distributed it free online and left printed copies at the county library. Labeled simply, "For anyone who's tired of bullies in suits." It spread faster than I expected. Within months, local newspapers were referencing it. Advocacy groups began quoting it, and homeowners from neighboring states contacted me for guidance. What had started as a personal defense became a movement. Even Sheriff Donovan reached out again, this time to help organize a workshop for residents about property rights and municipal boundaries. He admitted that what happened at Lake Pinnerest had forced law enforcement to confront a difficult truth. Too often, authority hides behind procedure. Sometimes the right thing to do means questioning the ones holding the clipboard. The lake community changed too. People who had avoided one another for years began rebuilding trust. Joint cleanups returned, shared barbecues replaced board meetings, and the once fearful air of compliance disappeared. The new HOA voted unanimously to establish the Pinnerest Preservation Alliance, a cooperative group made up of both HOA and non-HOA residents. Their mission was to maintain the lake's beauty, preserve its history, and keep corporate developers far from its shores. Nature seemed to respond in kind. That summer, the loons returned to nest near the northern inlet, a sight not seen in years. The water grew clearer, the docks more alive with fishing rods and children's laughter. The sound of hammering from cabin repairs mixed with the soft rustle of the forest. It was no longer a battlefield. It was a home again. As for Diana Peterson, she vanished quietly from public life. Her name appeared once more in a brief article about disciplinary actions taken by the state attorney's office, charges of fraud, falsification of documents, and misuse of nonprofit funds. No one celebrated, but no one mourned her fall either. Some neighbors said she spent her days walking alone through a small trailer park outside town, still clutching the remnants of old HOA paperwork, convinced that one day she'd rebuild her empire. But the world had moved on without her. On the anniversary of the court ruling, I hosted a lakeside barbecue. It wasn't a celebration of victory, just a gathering of people who had survived something together. Even those who had once sided with Diana came. They brought food, music, and a sense of peace that felt long overdue. As evening fell, the lake glowed orange with the sunset. I sat on my repaired roof, looking down at the porch below. the same one that had started everything. The cobalt blue had faded slightly from the sun, softened by weather and time, but I liked it that way. Imperfect, real, a reminder that strength doesn't always mean perfection. Sometimes it means refusing to bend. When night settled over the lake, I thought of my father. I imagined him sitting beside me the way he had when I was a boy, teaching me how to skip stones across the water. He'd once told me that integrity wasn't something you spoke about. It was something you proved when no one else would stand with you. He'd been right. Lake Pinarest had changed me. It had reminded me that silence only feeds bullies. That law is only as strong as those willing to enforce it, and that even a single homeowner can expose corruption if they document, persist, and refuse to back down. In the distance, the new HOA president, Sarah, was laughing with neighbors near the fire pit. The sound carried across the water, mingling with the songs of crickets and the splash of a fish breaking the surface. It was the sound of peace hard won and deeply deserved. Some battles end in noise, shouts, sirens, the slam of courtroom doors. Mine ended in stillness, a calm lake, a blue porch, a community reborn, and somewhere in that reflection, under the fading light, was the quiet truth I'd fought for all along. Freedom isn't granted by rules. It's protected by courage.